Welcome back to Write Out Loud, the podcast where stories come to life, the words leap off the page. I'm your host, Matt, and as always, I'm joined by the brilliant, effervescent, endlessly energetic, and downright dazzling Christina.
What does effervescent mean in this context?
It just means...
I don't know that I've ever been called effervescent.
bubbly.
I mean,
And
it makes me think of, what is a plop, up, fizz, fizz?
You are Alka-Seltzer for the soul, my dear. That is what you are. So that works. That works well.
If only people knew.
So today,
What do you think?
Today, we are cracking open one of the most important parts of any book, the first chapter. That crucial opening isn't just about setting the scene. It's about grabbing your reader by the collar and refusing to let go. I do want to introduce a very special guest who is with us as well.
Please do.
We're excited to welcome a very special guest, romance author, Susanna Strom. Welcome to the podcast, Susie.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. We are excited to talk to you today about this. And here's why we asked you to be here is because
Susie is one of my clients, and she came to me with her first full-length novel. And we worked together on that book, and there was something that happened, and it was severalfold. Susie handed in her first draft, and when I discussed the first draft with her and told her some things, was teaching her firstly about show versus tell. We've had that podcast discussion before, and she literally blew me away when she sent me back her first chapter after that first edit. And I actually went to my BFF and sent her to her and said, "Can you believe this?" And I sent it to you and said, "Can you believe this?" And then even years later, I incorporate it into my talks. I asked Susie's permission to be able to show them the first draft and then the second draft. And I think with Susie's permission, we'll also maybe post that along with the podcast on our website. But give you a little bit of a rundown. The story is an apocalyptic pandemic, and it opens with the main character, who is a college student, studying for tests and stuff, and her best friend runs in and says, "We've got to go pack a bag." And while that's exciting, Susie took on the challenge of the show versus tell, and to this day wrote the most suspenseful, creepy shower scene that can only be compared to Psycho. Only in a sense that there's no man with a knife, pulling the shower curtain. But she hears these noises and things are happening around. Like I said, we'll get Susie's permission to post the chapter. But yeah, and it just blew me away that she could write such an opening.
Wow, thank you. I'm amazed. I think what I learned is I started the first draft in the wrong place, and the reader didn't have any reason to care about Kenzie or what was going on with her. I just dropped them into the action too quickly. And so I needed to establish something about Kenzie. You find out that she's afraid of the dark in the first couple pages, You get this sense of creepy foreboding, or that's what I was aiming for anywhere.
Yes.
Anyway,
Mhm.
that something is going on in the dorm. And by the time her roommate rushes into the room hours later and says, the world's going to Hector's Pups on Toast, we've got to get out of here, then you care about Kenzie and what she's going through. And the mood has been set, and it felt better. I was
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
happy you told me I started in the wrong place.
Yeah. And I don't know so much that it was that you started in the wrong place. I think, yes, you established that later that, hey, you know what? This isn't correct. But I think mine was that it was all, okay, I've got to catch our audience up on what's happening in the world, which is tell.
Mhm.
And the way that you did the creep factor exponential scene just up the ante of like,
Mhm.
okay, you established this is not your average romance. This is going to take you places that you don't know you're going to go. And I think for me, seeing that first chapter turn into what it was makes this conversation even more interesting because, you didn't have it the first time around.
Mhm.
You went back after edits and said, okay, how can I do this better? And you just explaining that just now, I wasn't aware of that either because we didn't talk about that. All we talked about was like, just like I said, my mind just, I couldn't handle it. It was like, I've got to send this to everybody I know because can you imagine how good last week, or was it the week before, we were talking about the mystery box.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That's exactly what you wrote. You wrote the mystery box.
Mhm.
Mhm.
100%. Yeah.
I tried to raise questions early on. Why did someone turn the light off? Who
Mhm.
walked past the shower curtain and didn't say, hey? And so just drop hints that something is a little off in this world. Why
Mhm.
is someone passed out in front of the TV in the TV room? And you've always told me I can enrich the characters and enrich the chapters as I go. And that's one of my very favorite things. That's why I love editing is my very favorite part of the writing process, because I have the bones of a good story and I go in and add more and enrich the characters and deepen the relationships and just build on what I already have. And it's so much fun. So when people say
Yeah.
they hate editing, I just go, what are you talking about? It's the
Yeah.
most fun part of the process.
And
Well, I think you
that's-
said something too in that first part where you were saying you drop them into the middle of the story, right? Like you dropped them into that piece. And it's something Christina says all the time, which is start where the story starts,
Mhm.
right? Because it's going to make people want to know what's going on. Like, wow, what's happening here? And just like we got done talking about with the mystery box piece, it's questions, questions, answers, questions, questions, answers, not just questions, 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 question, right?
Yeah. And not just answers
Mhm.
either.
Correct.
Yeah. And I think that the piece with start where the story starts, it also takes away any of that stuff of like, okay, so in order for my audience to know who these people are, I have to give you a laundry list of things that happened before the story opens. And you really don't, for me, it's not necessary. You can drop it into the middle of the story. And even though Matt has not watched Paradise,
Oh,
Susie and I,
that's a crime.
so, no spoilers, no spoilers. But I think they do the same thing. They drop you into the middle of the action
Mhm.
and the beginning of the story. So this is not a spoiler because if you don't know this, then you've not even watched or looked at anything or heard anything from Paradise. So I don't believe I'm giving out a spoiler, but the president is assassinated at the beginning of the
Mhm.
story. And then when they need to, they do flashbacks. But I want to go back to something that Susie also said that I want to reiterate is that she loves the editing process. So it doesn't necessarily matter what that killer first chapter is. you don't have to spend a lot of time on it in your first draft.
Mhm.
You can go back and rewrite it. And I actually have a client who does exactly that. She has these intriguing openings, but it's usually a scene from somewhere in the book that she brings forward, but she doesn't know what that scene is going to be and a lot of times we'll sit and discuss now this isn't always, it's not always that she does this, but some of them that she does, we actually say, here's a really great suspenseful scene that you can bring to the forward and do what you do. So I don't think in writing a first chapter, do you need to write a first chapter first.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That's really interesting that you say that. And I think putting those two things together gives me a whole different perspective on it, because I hadn't thought about that before. You can actually write your entire book, tell your whole story, and then go back and say, what's the best way to start this off? Right now that I know everything that's taking place,
yeah,
how do I really start this off so that I do, like we said, grab the reader by the collar and just don't let go?
Yeah. And it's like what Susie said, and Susie, feel free to chime in on this, because as you're writing, you could come across something that like, oh, this is how I do that, or this is how I open, or I need to do this before I do that. But what's important is no one should skip the editing process. And I'm not just talking copy editing, which is grammar and that sort of thing. That's an absolute, you should absolutely do that no matter what. But I don't believe in writing it once and handing it over to the copy editor. You owe it to yourself to do, even if you don't hire a developmental editor, you still owe it to yourself to go through and reread and rewrite, because it's that editing process that brings in the good stuff.
Right.
I don't think I've ever read a first draft that wasn't made 10 times better by a second draft.
Mm-hmm.
I think the standard advice is do not edit as you go. And some people even say you should just vomit out a first draft, don't do any corrections, leave the typos behind, leave blank spaces where you're going to fill in the details later. And I can't do that. My brain is not wired to leave a mess behind. I have to correct the spelling. I think of something that can be improved. I try to improve it as I go. So I think Tina would tell you I write pretty clean first drafts. But my second drafts are always better, because I turn over to Tina what I think is a decent first draft. My heart's always in my throat, and I'm always thinking she's going to say, no, this one is the turd, honey. But so far that hasn't happened.
Hey, I was just going to say, how many books have we done together? And I've never said that.
8. We've done 8 together. But as much care and time as I put into writing the first draft, and I am slow. For me, 2,000 words a day is a damn good day. Someday it's 500 words, and I write almost all day. I'm at my desk from morning until late afternoon. But my second draft is always better, because I read the first draft and say, okay, where can I hit the emotion harder? Where can I make sure I put the backstory in at the right place so I don't dump it in the first chapter, which is like the kiss of death. That's what I did the first time I wrote my first book. Was I spent 3 pages giving the backstory, and it was boring as all get out. My second drafts are always much better, even though I do write pretty clean first drafts.
Yeah. And you do write very clean first drafts, but I think a lot of people don't understand what you're looking at isn't necessarily, I need to correct stuff or something isn't working. What you're doing is you're adding the details.
Mm-hmm.
You are adding the things that make the story more rich. Because now that you know the whole story, you can then go back and go, wait a minute, you know what? I can put a little hint in here about what's going to happen later on. Foreshadowing. I can put a little bit of a red herring in here. Now that I know the story isn't going that direction, I can start to lead people in the opposite direction and make it a twist, make it a surprise. There's so many things that you can do with a second draft that you can't do during your first draft.
It's where I play.
Yes, it's where you play. Yeah. And the thing is, I know that we're talking about the first killer chapter, but the thing of it is, when you finish that first draft, I don't think a lot of people realize you feel relief. You
Mm.
feel like, okay, the stress is over. And that's the moment that the creativity can open.
Mm-hmm.
That's why a lot of people don't stress about that first draft, because all it needs to be is done. You can go back and fix anything. What is Nora Roberts, her famous, I can fix anything but a blank page.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go back and do that. And let me tell you, I don't even know how many people I've edited for. I literally have to make a list and check it off. I don't know anybody who writes a killer first chapter out of the gate unless it is where the story starts. My best friend passed away a few years ago, and she was a writer, and she told me about this story that she wanted to write. And the reason I'm being evasive is because her daughters have now taken over her writing. So hopefully one of them will do this story. But she had the most unique opening I've ever heard as a first chapter, first opening. But yeah, so if you don't know that sort of thing, like if you don't have the golden nugget in the beginning, write the book, and then you can figure out, okay, how best to start this story. What do the readers need to know, have to know? How much can I keep it the mystery box?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you think about different techniques for starting that first chapter too, you can think about how it might be different from what people are expecting. So this could be an opening chapter that literally is one sentence, right? Maybe it's an opening chapter that's just a couple of paragraphs and it's just the most nebulous kind of thing, but it's enough because it's starting where the story starts. It's enough to keep you interested and want to know more and want to explore that. There's so many different ways that you can do it and really, again, just grab people, pull them in, make them want to know more and make them want to turn that page. So experiment with it too. I think there's no real wrong way to do this other than all tell.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because then we do get bored. And if we don't finish the first chapter, how are we going to finish the rest of the book?
I have absolutely put down books that even the first page didn't catch my attention.
Yeah. I'm going to paraphrase Stephen King because I can't remember the quote quite yet. But he says something like, you want to invite the reader in, like, come closer. I'm going to tell you this story. Come in. You want to hear this.
Yep.
Well, I'll have to send that to you, Matt, so you can post it on the page, or I'll post it to the social media when this episode airs. But that's exactly what you want. You want to invite the reader in. Come closer. I think
the other thing that we're dealing with is the fact that attention spans keep getting shorter.
Yeah.
Right? So if you don't grab their attention, if you don't have that killer kind of first chapter, and again, we've talked all about how you get there. We're not saying you have to do it right away in terms of writing it. But when you're putting a book out there, that first chapter needs to grab people's attention, right? And this is just the ways that you can do that. And just think about how any of the stories that you've read yourself that have grabbed your attention, that you just loved from the first page because it was so either explosive or mysterious or whatever, but it just grabbed that attention and just would not let go.
Yeah. There's actually one Julie Garwood book that I actually used for a college paper as a reference, but literally it told us that it was a historical. There was some bishop in there that was teaching young children, and he was telling the kids that women at that time were last in God's love. And literally Julie says, but this was a story about a girl who knew different. And I was like, okay, I'm in.
Hooked.
I'm in. Yeah. But yeah, that's a first chapter is inviting the reader in. And the first chapter should absolutely give the audience the feelings that they're going to have for the rest of the book.
Or at least a precursor to it.
Or a precursor to it. And I think that's why, Susie, your chapter worked so well, because, that book was very suspenseful. It was just
foreboding.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, those books, the first 2 books in that series, we worked on maybe 3 drafts.
I think 3.
4 drafts. And I
3.
told you, I remember telling you, even after so many times of reading this, like, I can't wait to get back to these characters again. Because I think you did such a good job with setting the stage for the entire series and with that first chapter.
That's awesome.
I think one of my favorite compliments about the first book was you told me later, while you were waiting for the second book, that you kept thinking about the characters and wondering what they were up to.
Yes.
And that was such a good feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, I'm thinking maybe there's another book in that series after all, because I'm missing them now.
That's awesome.
As she grins.
Susie, when you sit down to write, and especially those, I know you like the editing process, right? And pulling it together, but how much of the story is pre-planned versus just kind of go with the flow? I'm just curious.
Well, one of the reasons I think I had so much trouble producing story when I was younger was I knew myself, and I said, I am an organized person who likes lists. I like checking things off a list. I like certainty. I am not a particularly brave person. I like to have guardrails and know what's going on. So I assumed that I was a writer who would outline and plot, and that I would have the certainty of knowing where the story was going. And that was what I tried to impose on myself. And every time I started writing a book, it would peter out because the story would fall apart. I couldn't see enough to make a coherent outline. And I came to realize that despite the fact that I like certainty and I like guardrails and I like predictability, I'm a person whose creative muse will go on strike if I try to impose an outline on a book. So when I sit down to write a book, I've told Tina this, everything I know about the book will fit on a note card. I don't really do character studies. I think about the 2 main characters a bit. I walk around and think about the book and the characters and what could happen to them, but I really don't know where it's going. I use what I call the tent pole method of planning. I know about where the story starts. I know something big that will happen in the middle, and I have some sense of where I want it to end. It's like the tent poles that will hold up the book.
Got it.
But I don't know the journey, and I could not outline the journey because I have to live through it with my characters. I have to experience the scene with them and see who walks on the stage and see how they emotionally react to what's going on and move forward from there.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, that's interesting. It's different than what I had anticipated, but I think that your answer is perfect in that I think we're going to have a whole other episode on that just by itself.
Yeah. In fact, it reminds me of Scarlett Cole. When she was on the podcast, she even said for her previous books, didn't she outline them thoroughly? But for some reason with this new series, she's actually better at just totally pantsing it. So it's interesting that you guys are, like you, Susie, it's almost the opposite of what your personality is. But yet with Scarlett Cole, she switched halfway, I don't even want to say halfway through her writing career, but she had written a good number of books. We're talking 20 books or more before she flipped. So it's interesting that with Susie, it is not her norm. And in fact, the opposite of her personality. And with Scarlett Cole, it was like, it can change. Yeah. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that's maybe a future.
I think so. We'll have to explore that some more. Oh my gosh. So Susie, we have absolutely enjoyed having you on the podcast. Tell me, if you're listening, where can we find more from Susanna Strom?
Well, my books are available on Amazon and wide. You can read them on Kindle Unlimited, Apple, Barnes& and Noble, all over. Get them in many libraries. You can go to susannastrom.com. Follow me on Facebook under author Susanna Strom.
Nice.
And I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky.
Excellent.
And I was going to say, I've worked with Tina for 8 books, and the first book she was talking about is Pandemonium, which is the first book in my post-apocalyptic romance series. The series is complete at 5 books, unless I get a feeling that I need to write another book, and I'm thinking of that. I also have a paranormal romance series called The Black Rock Guardians about wolf shifters and grizzly shifters, shifter wars, and cousins finding out that shifters exist. I love that series. That's really probably the series of my heart. And working on book 4 in that series, Beneath a Shifter Sky. And right now I'm finishing work on a new portal fantasy romance. It's a low fantasy, something in the feeling of Outlander, where a modern human woman finds herself in a different world. Kind of a low magic, low fantasy world, but I love the idea of going through a portal, finding yourself somewhere else, and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah,
Keep
that's
safe.
Awesome. That's awesome.
So I'm having a lot of fun things going on.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Well, good. Definitely check out Susanna's books. Again, we've absolutely loved having you as we wrap up here.
Have to come back on when we talk about plotting versus pantsing.
Yes, we'll do that.
Or finding your writing system. I like that idea too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. Your guide to writing a first chapter that grabs hooks and won't let go. And if there's one thing to remember, it's this. Readers don't just need a good start. They need a reason to keep reading. So set the tone, create curiosity, and make every single word count, because that's what's important. So if today's episode helped you at all, please we'd love to hear about it. Share your favorite first lines, whether it's your own work or a book that you love. Share it on social media. Tag us at WriteOutLoudPod. And don't forget, keep writing, keep crafting unforgettable stories, and as always, write out loud. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. We really hope that you're enjoying every bit of it, but we would love to hear your feedback. Drop us an email either to matt@writeoutloudpod.com or christina@bookmatchmaker.com. We would love to hear your thoughts. What's working, what's not working, and what do you want to hear more of? Thanks so much. We really appreciate it.